for such a warm welcome, everyone. Thank you. That's so nice. This is a new talk for me, so those are always the more nerve-wracking ones. I spoke at a Donut.js like 2 years ago, and it was a wonderful experience, so I feel very safe bringing a new talk here, so hopefully it'll go okay. But yes, hello. My name is Vaidehi. And I am an engineer at a company here in Portland called Tilda, and we work on a product called Skylight, which is your favorite Rails and Ruby profiler. Side note, we are actually hiring, so come talk to me after that. I'm not going to say anything else about that the rest of the talk, but I will be here. You can talk to me. We are hiring. But what I do want to talk to you about today is what we talk about when we talk about the JavaScript object model. I want to talk to you about these curly braces. I want to talk to you about JavaScript objects. If you've used JavaScript, if you've played with it, if you've seen it, you've probably seen an object, used an object, probably interacted with it when you didn't even know you were interacting with it. They are everywhere. They're the cornerstone of the JavaScript language. And when we think about objects, we probably think about something that looks like this. This is an empty object. It's a very sad, empty cat. We're just calling it cat. It's going to be around for the rest of this talk, so get comfortable. But this is like probably what you imagine when you think about a JavaScript object. They're pretty ubiquitous. You see them a lot. But how many of us actually know how it works? You don't have to raise your hands, but I'll raise my hand. Until I learned about the JavaScript object model, I didn't know a lot about how objects really worked. But today that's going to change. I learned about how the JavaScript object model works under the hood, and I thought it was so fascinating. So hopefully today, by the end of this, you will find it at least somewhat fascinating too. If not, this cat will be around, and you can just imagine a cute cat every single time you see it. So JavaScript objects can be created with or without properties. For example, here is a cat object, and we've created a sound property, and it's equal to a string called meow. We can have properties on them or not, but usually when we think about objects, we think about properties being attached to them. We can kind of think about properties being variables that are attached to objects. And when we access or interface with any kind of JavaScript object, we're usually doing it with two types of notations, either dot notation or bracket notation. And that's how you access the property, because usually you have properties so you can do something with them down the road. But there are actually other ways of interfacing with properties on an object. I am talking about property descriptors. By the way, I found some interesting animations when I was doing this talk, so there are going to be some stuff to look out for. So JavaScript objects come built in with property descriptors. And property descriptors are actually objects within themselves, which just like blows your mind. And what they are, they basically describe the nature of a property on an object. We can think of property descriptors as the metadata, the internal metadata on an object. So we can kind of get a full picture of what an object actually looks like by looking at an object's property descriptors. So how do you look at a property descriptor on an object? Well, you can use some methods off the object constructor API or the reflect API. You should probably use the reflect API for reasons I can't get into today. But do as I say, not as I do, because everything's going to be object constructor because it's easier to write. So you have a property on an object. How do you see its descriptor? Well, we can use a method on the object constructor called getOwnPropertyDescriptor. And in this case, we have a sound property. Let's see what that descriptor metadata thing looks like. Well, it looks like this. This is the object property. Sorry, this is the property descriptor on our object. I might do that again. There's a lot of words that all sound the same. And we can call object.getOwnProperty to see the metadata of that property. So, wait, I thought objects and properties are just key value pairs. No, they actually have this little object inside of them that they carry around in this little like suitcase, and they peek their head out and they're like, hi, I'm a descriptor. That's what they look like. And then you see them and you're like, oh, scream cat. So when you look at an object's property, for example, sound, you can see that its descriptor has 4 keys on it. In this case, we see it has value, writable, enumerable, and configurable. We're going to start by just looking at 2. Let's look at value and writable. The value and writable keys actually tell us a lot about the sound property. The fact that they exist tell us that this is a data property. So what is a data property? A data property is one that has some value which may or may not be writable, which means you can edit it, you can change it. And in our case, we had a sound property, and it has a value, which is a string, and we can change it because it's writable. Makes sense so far, hopefully. The interesting thing is that a data property can be equal to a lot of things. So it could be a string, it could be a number, it could be another object. It could also be a function. So here's another property on our cat. Our cat's getting a little like sassier now. It's like it has this say hi property, and it's like very cheerful. It's like hi. But this is just a data property. Of course, because a data property right now we're assuming it's writable. That means you can write to it and you can reassign it. So our cat could get kind of sassy. You could use the property accessor and just reassign what the value of that function is, which may or may not be good. Depends on how you like your cats. But in either case, because all of these are data properties, we know that there's going to be some value for it, whether it's a string or a number or a function. Anything that you can assign onto an object could be the value of the data property. And we know we can rewrite it. So in this case, when we're looking at the property descriptor of our say hi function, you can see that the value is actually a function, which makes sense. That's what we just assigned. But there were 2 properties I just showed you, but there were actually 4 on the descriptor. So what about those other 2 things? Well, they're enumerable and configurable, and it's time for us to talk about them. We're going to talk about them multiple times in this talk. They're very interesting. So they're actually pretty special keys. They have nothing to do with data properties, data descriptors specifically. They're going to exist on every property descriptor ever, which is why they're so interesting. So what is enumerable? Enumerable tells us whether a property descriptor is going to allow the property to be visible when we enumerate over it. So basically, if a property descriptor's value for enumerable is true, it basically means, hey, this property is going to show up if you enumerate over it. What does it mean to enumerate? Well, it could be a for in loop, and if you're using a for in loop over the object, then if the property's value for enumerable is true, it's going to show up. Also, if you call object.keys on the object, in order for it to show up in that situation, the enumerable property has to be true. You might be wondering, don't you always want everything to show up when you enumerate? Hold that thought. We'll come back to it. Maybe not. Okay, so we talked about enumerable. What about configurable? Configurable tells us whether the property that we're looking at, the descriptor for the property that we're looking at, can be modified or deleted. So if a property has a value for configurable set to false, it means, hey, you can't configure it, don't touch this. It basically means you can't delete it, you can't modify it, but so far everything we've looked at, all the property descriptors have had configurable true. You might be wondering, is that going to change? Yeah, we'll come back to that. But first, I want to tell you about another type of property. Another type of property that we can assign on objects if you're using ES5. If you're not using ES5, if it predates ES5, you can just cover your ears. Or maybe you should leave them uncovered, and then you'll be like, oh, I should use ES5, or actually ES6, which is more modern. But I'm talking, of course, about getters and setters. Getters and setters kind of look just like other properties that you might interact with, but they're actually functions that write and retrieve a value. So they're pretty useful when you want to access a property that might be dynamic or dynamically return a value. So in this situation, we have a getter where you can see it's pulling another property off the object, doing something to it, and then There's just like some random math in there because it's dynamic, and I couldn't come up with a better example. But the point being is that this getter is going to return a dynamic value whenever you call it. But the way that you call it is similar to how you would call another property on an object. So when we look at the property descriptor for this getter, and we can call, again, getOwnPropertyDescriptor and call loudSound, which is the name of our getter function. If we look at what that actually returns, we'll see that it gives us a property descriptor, and it has configurable and enumerable, except writable and value are nowhere to be found. Instead, we have these other things. We have get and set is actually undefined. There's a reason for that. It's because we didn't write a setter. But get and set are actually indicators of the type of property that we're looking at. Remember that the property descriptor is kind of like this hidden peek into what that property actually is. So by just looking at that property descriptor, you can understand what type of property is on the object. And that's the same situation here. So we're not dealing with the same properties that we saw when we were looking at data properties. There's no writable, there's no value. Instead, there's get and set, which tells us this is an accessor property, not a data property. Different. Accessor properties come with a pair of getter-setter functions, and they aren't going to have the same keys that we saw before. Instead, they have a set function, and they have a get function. But if you think about it, they kind of are mirror images of the data property, because the set property, or the set key, is basically the equivalent of the writable key in the data property, and the get key is basically the same as the value property. And so if you start to think about it, of course it would be weird to have both value and get, because how would you know which one is the right one? Is the getter going to return the correct value for the property, or is value going to return it? So we have getters and setters, but because they can retrieve dynamic values, this means that a getter could compute a different value every time. So that's important to remember. They're not quite the same as data properties. The gotcha with getters is that you can invoke them the same as data properties, but even though you're using the dot syntax, you shouldn't be fooled into thinking that you'll get the same value, because they are dynamic. So now we have two types of properties, two different types of descriptors. What next? Well, you can modify and manipulate properties, and it makes you feel very powerful. And then you end up in situations where you did a thing that you didn't mean to do, which may or may not have happened to me. So, by default, all JavaScript objects are extensible. And what that means is that new properties can be added to them, which makes sense. That's kind of how we've been operating this whole time. We created a cat, and we added some stuff to it, and nobody said, hey, you can't do that, because the object was extensible. But you can change the extensibility of an object on a property basis, or even on an object basis too. So let's return back to configurable and enumerable. They've returned for their encore, and here they are. They're going to make our lives a little tricky, or fun, depends on your perspective. We can modify these two, which exist on data properties and accessor properties, in order to limit the interface of an object. So for example, we might say, oh, I don't want anyone to add properties to this object or remove them, but they can keep writing to things that are writable. That's fine. In this situation, we could actually seal the object. It was in this moment when I really wish there was a seal emoji, but there's not. That would have been great. For example, let's say we have this cat, and we're like, okay, you can write to it, you can write to the properties that are already writable, but no more adding properties, no more removing properties, not allowed. So we can seal our cat object, in which case we'll see that the property descriptor for sound looks different than it looked like before. Before we sealed it, configurable was set to true. However, now configurable is false, which means you can't, if you go and try to add another property to this, in strict mode, it'll actually give you a type error. And Now you basically have to work within the confines of whatever cat is, its properties, and whatever it's going to return to you, and that's it. But you can still write to it. Maybe we don't want to write to it. Maybe we want to complicate things even further, and maybe we want no new properties, no removing of properties. And you know what? You can't even write to properties. We basically want to make this object immutable. Well, we can do that. We can freeze the object, and it's going to do something to your property descriptors. So for example, say we have this cat, and we're like, bad cat, put you outside. I don't condone this. Don't actually do this. This is terrible. But say we just object.freeze this cat. We froze our cat object, and it's okay. We'll bring it inside to the fire later, next to the fire. It's all. It's fine. This cat is ephemeral. Don't get too emotionally attached to it. Say we froze our cat object, and suddenly our property descriptors are going to look different. All of our writable values, all of our writable properties are now no longer true. They're false. You can't change the value of them. And they're not configurable, which means this object is not extensible. You can't do anything to it. Frozen in time. But there are some things to be careful when it comes to freezing objects, cats or otherwise. First, if you freeze an object and your object has getters, remember that getters are dynamic. So if we froze that cat and it had that loud sound function, the getter function, that's still going to do math.random. You're not guaranteeing that that getter is going to always return a single number. So remember, getter is dynamic. If you're going to freeze something, you need to be aware of what you're doing, because it might behave differently. The other thing is, I said earlier that you can assign an object as the value of a property on an object. If you do this, well, you better have a friend nearby to remind you that the object, that is the value, is not necessarily going to freeze when you freeze the main object. So something else to think about. Finally, let's talk about enumerable. Most of the objects that we deal with in JavaScript are going to inherit from a prototype of some sort, which we can think of as the parent constructor object that every object will inherit from in some way. That might be different for different types of objects, but it will exist. When it comes to objects, however, enumerable properties are only going to really show up for us when we're looking at the object's own properties. So what that means is the parents or the prototype object, those properties are not going to be enumerable. This might seem a little convoluted, but there's a reason for this. Let's take a look at an array, which is actually just an object. And let's just say we'll look at the property descriptor for an array. Well, it turns out apparently arrays have a property called length, and its value is 0, which is probably what you expect. You can write to it, which makes sense because somebody somewhere is probably going to update the value of that when you add something to the array. You can not enumerate and not configure this property, which is probably good because I don't want someone changing what array does or array.length does, because I depend on that a lot, as I'm sure a lot of people do. But why is enumerable false? Well, if enumerable was true, then anytime you iterated over that array, length would show up. And you probably only care about the contents of the array, the properties within the array, not the length method. And actually, the same goes for the prototype. We haven't really talked about this proto thing, but if you call object.getOwnProperty descriptors on any JavaScript object, you will see this prototype. And that basically is the parent object for whatever it is that you're looking at. But for example, in array, some of the things inside of proto are like entries and map and all these functions that I'm glad they exist, but I don't want them in my loops. And that would be very miserable. That there's a reason that it doesn't show up in JavaScript, and it's because those properties are enumerable false by default, so that when you look at the properties of an object, you're not pulling everything else that it inherited from all of its ancestors as well. So it's actually kind of cool. So, remember the curly braces? Turns out they're not as simple and basic as maybe we thought. Objects are a little bit complex. But they're also super cool. It's really interesting to start digging into how these things work because you start to understand why API authors and library authors have to consider things like enumerability, or why they need to consider legacy code using for-in loops. Because if you don't think about the enumerability of something within a constructor that someone else might be relying on, you might break old apps or people trying to use your own open source code. So they're complex, they're cool, but really the most important thing is that they are actually accessible to us. You can just open up your JavaScript console, play with this stuff, and then start Googling, find the MDN docs, and you'll probably find some version of one of these methods within any framework that you work with, which is pretty awesome. So if you take anything away from this talk, aside from don't freeze your cat, don't be afraid to peek under the hood to understand how things work. It might seem scary and daunting at first, and maybe it is a little tricky, but you'll find out that you're actually probably more equipped than you realize to understand how these things work, and then maybe you'll feel a little bit better about JavaScript by the end of the day. Thank you so very much.